Okay. Federal Reserve notes, also United States banknotes or U.S. banknotes, are the banknotes currently used in the United States of America. Now that's kind of funny because that would imply that the United States and the United States of America have some sort of contract.
Hmm.
All right, we'll leave that alone. Denominated in the United States dollars. Federal Reserve notes are printed by the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing on paper made by Crane and Company of Dalton, Massachusetts. Okay? Federal Reserve notes are the only type of U.S. banknote currently produced. Federal Reserve notes are authorized by Section 16 of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and are used to the Federal Reserve Banks or are issued to the Federal Reserve Banks at the discretion of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. The notes are then put into circulation by the Federal Reserve Banks, at which point they become liabilities of the Federal Reserve Bank and obligations of the United States. This is what we want to focus on. The notes are put into circulation by the Federal Reserve Banks, at which point they become liabilities of the Federal Reserve Banks and obligations of the United States. So, really quickly, I want to do something here. Okay? In finance, when you look at the word liability, you have different types. Remember, we saw before that you have to be precise when you're looking at a particular term. Legal liability, public, product liability, liability as far as financial accounting. That is the type of liability that the Federal Reserve Bank um, has. And it does not mean that they have a liability in terms of a loss. Okay, they do have an obligation, so to speak, or they do take a risk, but it's not necessarily a total loss. I don't want to get too far into that, but just to let you know, they don't have too much of a suffrage in terms of their responsibility in this Federal Reserve thing. However, when you read what I just read, this is a recap of what I just read right here, of what I just read from Wikipedia. Okay, so we're going to go back over the last part I just read. The notes that are then put into circulation by the Federal Reserve Banks, at which point they become, right in here read, liabilities of the Federal Reserve Bank and obligations of the United States. So anyone doing business with the United States, doing business with those Federal Reserve Banks contracted to the United States, are also under that obligation. Okay, that would make sense. Now let's look at obligation. All right, obligation. Look at all these neat words that are the same, that mean the same as obligation. The word up here in the top. All right, or rather right here. Accountability, agreement, bond, burden, commitment, commitment, constraint, contract. Wow, debt. Wow, duty, liability, necessity, need, promise, requirement, right, trust. Trust. Okay, I don't think I need to make that any clearer. When you use Federal Reserve notes, you enter into the same trust that the United States has with the Federal Reserve Banks by proxy, and you are exposing your trust to the trust that the obligations from using those Federal Reserve notes brings upon you via the United States. Okay, I hope I made that clear. You're mixing your trust, your private trust, with the public trust if your trust is dealing directly with Federal Reserve notes. Okay? We have the word trust here. Guess what type of trust that's entering into that you're entering into when using the Federal Reserve notes. An implied trust. You put your private trust in direct conflict with the obligatory trust of the Federal Reserve when you use property and privilege of the Federal Reserve System, a contracted party of the United States corporation by operation of law. So here is that implied trust when you use Federal Reserve notes. Now again, if your trust is statutory, don't worry. Your trust is already public. It's already exposed to the public trust. There's no need to trip. But again, I'm showing you this to show you why you really need to be careful if you're going to venture into this private trust thing. All right. Now there are ways to bank without putting your private trust into this contract, but it takes the formation of true trust. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's almost impossible to transact business in the commercial realm without Federal Reserve notes. So I'm not suggesting you do that, but you know, that's another level. Okay, when you start to layer trust, and it is necessarily or not necessarily beyond the scope of this trust if you can really grasp what we're saying, or this course if you can really grasp what we're saying. But trust me, that is not something you want to try right off the giddy up. All right, that is not something you want to try right off the giddy up. Stick with the public trust. Start with the public trust, I should say, and let that be your practice, because there's really, listen, if you only have a couple of grand in your bank account and you got a private trust going, you're under no risk. The IRS is not coming after you over a couple grand. They're not going to try to delve into a trust that they already have permission to delve into over 2 grand. It's not going to happen. So you can make mistakes. You can dibble and dabble into trying to become private, or rather, because you can slowly acclimate yourself into a private capacity from the public. And as you do that, if you're doing it with, like I said, 2 or 3 grand, and you're making mistakes, even if they do come after you, first of all, it's a trust. You can simply collapse it, or you can tell them, yo, go ahead and have at it. And the trial and error will be worth it, because you'll gain knowledge in terms of how to operate privately. Okay, I know not to do that. And if you're doing that anyway, the consciousness that will come about in helping you to go private will come to you. All right, I don't want to get too deep into the metaphysical stuff, but just as with any study, the more you study it, the more answers come to you. The same with this public-private thing, okay? But you can take the risk, you can take the bumps and bruises with a simple bank account with a couple grand in it, if that, or a couple $100 in it, whatever the case may be, and extricate yourself from the private through that public trust, or move over to the private from that public trust to a private trust. Okay, and it sounds convoluted and difficult, but it's not.